Oh no.
We are now interviewing S.Wishart, professor at the School of Law of the University of Navarra and assistant dean of the International Law School of the same university. Scott, do you consider that single-sex high schools violate the basic principle of gender equality, or do you view them as an alternative for personalized education?
I definitely view them as an alternative for professionalized or personalized education for the child. A lot of it depends upon the school and how well they implement the program. But I do not see it as a discrimination in terms of gender equality. There can be problems with separate single-sex education if the programs are not well administered. But if they are very well administered, I think they can be a wonderful solution to many problems that we have in society today with educating our young people. I come from largely a mixed educational system, co-educational system in the United States. I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I was raised in a co-educational system, though we do have private schools in the United States where we can have single-sex education. I find both systems to be equally good. They solve different problems, but again, the quality of any one program, whether it be single-sex or co-educational, is paramount. And if the programs are conducted thoroughly, in a well-thought-out, well-planned manner, they are mutually efficient options to education.
Now, about psychological studies have shown that both genders manifest different behaviors in terms of the learning process, meaning that they respond to different incentives and learn at different rates. Some people argue that it is because of these differences that single-sex education is justified and is even desirable. Do you agree with this?
Yes, I do. My university studies, though I am a law professor and have been trained in the Anglo-American legal tradition, the study of law in the United States is at the graduate level. So you have to have a university degree to apply to law school. My university degree, 4 years of study, was in neuroendocrine psychology. I studied chemistry of the brain, hormones, and behavior. And from a psychological perspective, from a neurological perspective, men and women are different. And men and women mature at different rates. And this reality, this difference in maturity, the difference in the rates of maturity, can have a very significant impact on the classroom environment. Women mature more quickly than men. It's a reality. And because of this difference in maturity, young women need different elements of pedagogy, different teaching techniques possibly at different times in their lives than young men, especially in circumstances where we have some problems, some challenges. Maybe a child is struggling because of a family situation, or maybe a child has a learning disability that needs special attention. These elements in a co-educational environment, if they are not attended to, if they are not noticed because of the mixture of men and women and the size of the classroom, can become serious problems for those children that are not attended to. And one good thing about single-sex education is it makes the classroom environment less complex in some ways. Now, don't get me wrong, there is an advantage to co-education as well, but particularly in circumstances where there are problems, I think that single-sex education provides an opportunity in the classroom to attend to more personalized, individualistic needs of a child. And it's not to say that coeducation can't achieve similar ends. It's just that sometimes when you have boys and girls together, the social dynamic can become very complicated. And that can take away from the focus that education is all about, the classroom. And sometimes, from some perspectives, single-sex education can be a more efficient, process. And for that reason, I do think that it can address some needs for some children.
In recent years, Spain has suffered an increase in high school dropout rates, and also low grades are on the rise, particularly in men. Do you consider that male-only schools can reduce these rates more effectively than schools which have students of both genders? If so, why?
Okay. Here's a perfect example of what I was talking about. Problems. Problems in the classroom. Challenges, if you will. You know, we all come to school with different backgrounds. We have different family situations. We have different emotional situations. And we have different skills. In a coeducational classroom, when you have young women maturing more quickly than young men, and in the example, the question you just read to me, we're talking about young men with problems. In that type of a situation, you have a classroom with young women and young men of the same age. Young women mature more quickly than the young men, so they're already more mature in the classroom at that age than the young men. You already have a challenge because the women are maturing and possibly doing better in their studies than the young men. And the young men can have a potential to fall behind, not because necessarily they lack the skills, but sometimes they feel that they can't compete as well as the young women. And then it's a question of how do we address this problem? How do we help those young men that are falling behind? If we provide them with a lot of special attention, that can be a good thing, but it also can be a complicated thing because maybe they don't want to be identified as having a problem. So you already have a multiple dimensional classroom environment with coeducation. And you know, there are good things to this coeducational process. But sometimes when you have challenges, when you have some students with problems, the coeducational environment makes solving those problems more complex. And I think for that reason, single-sex education, certainly in the early years, in the early developmental years, as we mature and we become young adults, the idea of single-sex education becomes, I think, less important. It's in some ways it's even more important that you do interact together and have a realistic idea of what the opposite sex is all about. From one perspective, one criticism of single-sex education has been that it creates stereotypes of one sex for the other. And the reality of coeducation is, you know, you see one another. Men and women learn about themselves, about each other at the same time as they're growing up. This is a very good thing. It's an important thing. And I think that single-sex education can achieve that if they have a good program. Maybe separate classrooms for your studies, but active engagement in sports or active engagements in other social activities to maintain realistic understanding and knowledge about men and women. But specifically with regards to the challenges that some of our young men face, I think that single-sex education can help here. I certainly do feel that within the coeducational environment, solving those challenges is more complex. Not that they can't be solved, it's just a harder solution.
As you may know, nowadays single-sex high schools are a very controversial topic in Spain. According to Joan Curcó, General Director of Education Centers, one of the main reasons behind the controversy is that these types of schools are associated with the schools that existed in Spain during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Consequently, they are associated with an old and inadequate educational system. Do you agree with John Gurko's reasoning?
Well, I agree with the premise. And the premise is that everything must evolve. Okay? Every system must improve. Every system must maintain an awareness of advances in the field. And pedagogy, the process of teaching, has changed. We have gotten better. We've learned from psychology. We have learned from social sciences how to improve our teaching and our instruction. And so, in that general sense, I do agree with him. You know, education must evolve. It must improve constantly. But in the other sense, to say that single-sex education alone is antiquated is far too simplistic, because it does have benefits. But again, it depends upon the program. How well is that program administered? This is true of any system of education, co-educational or single-sex. So we cannot remain in the past. Absolutely, I agree with that. But to say that, to make a simplistic statement that single-sex education, by the very nature of being single-sex, implies that it's antiquated is not fair to single-sex education. It's a far more complex question than that.
No.
One of the main arguments that opponents of single-sex schools defend is that these high schools impact negatively on social interaction between teenagers of both genders in the short and the long term, and that they also promote gender stereotypes. Do you agree with these arguments?
Absolutely. And this is one of the unfortunate extreme consequences of single-sex education. And it must be corrected. It must be provided for against in terms of this reality. Single-sex education addresses the reality that men and women are different, and we evolve, we mature at differing rates. But there is a risk that if you keep the sexes apart, that the social interaction that would normally occur is limited. And as a result, we have a tendency to develop incorrect ideas about the opposite sex, and this can form stereotypes. As a result, the subsequent interaction between young men and young women at a later stage in their life, when they're thinking about families and the like, can become somewhat artificial. And that is something to avoid. But I would not agree with the statement that single-sex education alone is unable to properly integrate men and women. I think that you can have separate classrooms, but adequate programming that integrates the young women and the young men on a social basis, possibly through sports or other social activities within the high school itself, that helps to build a natural relationship between young women and young men. These stereotypes, these unrealistic attitudes about the opposite sex are problems, and these are some of the old criticisms that are very valid and can be levied against some of the older single-sex programs that we find here in Spain and in other parts of the world, not just here in Spain.
According to the opinion of Luz Martinez Ten, the Secretary of Social Politics of FETE and UCGT, the results of scientific research prove that differences in the learning process between men and women are not superior to the ones that exist in other groups of society. Thus, single-sex education would be just as retrograde as having schools for immigrants and handicapped. Do you consider this comparison accurate? Do you agree with it?
It presents a challenge. No, I don't agree with it. I think that if society could provide educational support for these differing groups that need special support, it would be a good thing. But to compare single-sex education and the process of separating young women from young men in their early years of education, and again, I'm talking about the early years of education. I'm not talking about later on, and in high school, and moving through the adolescent years, moving towards high school, there should be increasingly more interaction between the young women and the young men in the school environment. But to compare this idea of single-sex education with other groupings that can require special pedagogical support, I think is too extreme a comparison. Again, we are not talking about mature groups of people, immigrants possibly, or students with special needs. They also need support. What we're talking about in general is the concepts of single-sex education versus co-education. And the reality of life is that young women and young men mature at different rates. And that is what single-sex education can address very well. Now, is it necessary for everybody? No, no. There are some individuals, however, who face certain challenges in a co-educational environment. And we spoke earlier about the challenges of young boys. And because of the developmental rates that differ between young women and young men, sometimes young men can be left behind. And that is a problem. And the statistics are indicating that we have a problem in society that we need to address. And so I do agree that single-sex education can help with that problem. It's not the solution for everyone. Again, going back all the way back to our first question, I think it is an option for personalized education. And it's a part of family. I mean, your education fundamentally comes from home and the instruction you get from your parents. And then it is supplemented when you go to school. For some children, they need special attention. They need extra time, they need extra care. And a co-educational environment is a more complex environment for all of these dynamics, the difference in maturity, the social interaction of young men and young women. It makes the classroom, the co-educational classroom, a more complex environment. And in particular, for those young men, and young women at times, of course, but for those young men that we are statistically talking about here, for those young men with special needs, I think that single-sex education can help a lot. But it's not for everybody. And I think it should be one of multiple options for education. Co-education has its strength and its value, absolutely. But I understand the argument behind single-sex education, especially for those young men who are developing a little later than others. In a co-educational environment, they can lose themselves in the social dynamic that a co-educational classroom represents. So I see both perspectives. I value both systems of education, but I do see that single-sex education can help us meet the needs of some of our particularly needy young men at an important time in their life, at a stage of development that they only experience once.
That's very true. Thank you very much,
It's my
Scott.
pleasure. My pleasure.